Namaskar and welcome to this exciting show, Sathology, new episode on Sathology debunking mythology. Mythology destroys identity. It's a fake, it's a lie, it's a science of fake, and Sathology is a science of truth. Unfortunately, mythology has come to understand as history. So if you talk about ancient history and it doesn't have any basis, it's called mythology. But if you look at Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Vedic culture, the footprints are on every single part of the globe. We have covered it in many angles. In the Sugriva's Atlas, you found that how South America was heavily influenced or mentioned in Ramayana. Sugriva's army went there, and we also discovered how we reached Chile from the Southeast Asia. So we have already established that, and through various scientific ways, through various speakers. Today we are taking a different topic, which is more contemporary history. Kashmir is mentioned in Mahabharata. Arjun crosses Kashmir and goes to Uttar Kuru. It is already there. Kerala is also there. Karnataka is also there. So many of these names have been intrinsically part of the Indian landscape or Bharat Varsh. So today we are going to go a little bit closer to the history just 70 years back and see what happened over there and why it happened over there. So, without delay, we have very famous author and also speaker and writer, Sri Arun Anand ji. Welcome, Arun
Namaskar.
Anand ji. Namaskar.
Namaskar. Namaskar.
So, it has been such a dogma that Kashmir. Everybody says Kashmir, Kashmir, and Kashmir is made from two Indian words, Mira, which is known as a garden, and Kashyap is the name of the very sage, big great sage. So many of the Hindus have Gotra as Kashyap Gotra, and Kashyap Gotra, and the garden of Kashyap is called Kashmir, and that is referenced in some Puran also. So, but in the modern times, it is a small area, a small valley, you know, around 120 square kilometers, not as big area. And and so tell us what is the history of Kashmir and let the viewers understand what is it.
Uh, See, I think there's been a lot of course, Kashmir has, as you rightly mentioned, that it has been found in the ancient texts also, and it was never a Muslim majority. Uh, it was not a Muslim majority state, and you find a lot of evidences about Kashmir. It was basically a seat of learning, and as we have seen, and then it was also religiously, you can say from religious perspective, from religion Hindu Dharma perspective also, because you have no Amarnath cave there and a lot of ancient temples there. The part which is now occupied by Pakistan, the Pakistan occupied Jammu Kashmir, there also you have a lot of temples. So right since the beginning, it was basically a seat of learning, and and over a period of time during the medieval era, so gradually, a part of the Kashmir Valley, so it became the conversion started, and then in fact, there was not much conversion also. There are a lot of people who came from outside and they settled there, the Muslim population, the Muslim preachers. And then over a period of time, the Kashmir Valley largely basically became Muslim dominated. And when India got independence at that time, Kashmir was overall because of the Muslim population there. So Kashmir was a Muslim majority state ruled by basically a Hindu king who wanted to join, accede to India. There were two other states also, Junagadh and Hyderabad, which faced similar issues. And in Hyderabad, you had the ruler who was Muslim and Nizam, and he wanted to go to Pakistan, but the people they wanted to come to India. And similarly in Junagadh also, it had almost a similar situation like Hyderabad. So overall, Jammu Kashmir, you can say, it was the jewel in the crown of Bharat, Kashmir. Whether it was knowledge, whether it was learning, whether it was tourism, whether it was nature's beauty or natural resources, and more importantly, its strategic position. In fact, in 47, what we saw the way Britishers ensured balkanization of Kashmir because they wanted, and in fact, behind this idea of creation of Pakistan also, this balkanization of India, which they did, was always to create a buffer zone there. And Kashmir, that is why, became a very, very important part of the whole scheme of things. In fact, it was used as a chessboard for the great game which was played in Central Asia. And Afghanistan also suffered to a large extent because of that. And we saw a lot of suffering in Kashmir also because it became a pawn uh, in the game of superpowers, which were happening in 40s, 50s, and 60s. So this is overall, you can say, the brief history of Jammu Kashmir. In I just want to mention one thing here. See, right now, but we are today when we are going to talk about it, so we are going to talk about trying. Where I'm going to try and talk about the complete Jammu and Kashmir. So there are three parts of Jammu and Kashmir. One is which is in India. The second part is what you call POJK, Pakistan occupied Jammu Kashmir, and the third part about which generally people do not talk. So that's COJK, that is China occupied Jammu Kashmir. A large part of Kashmir was given away by Pakistan to China. So that's the overall big picture of Kashmir. So when we talk about invasion and what happened in 47, so we would talk in that context.
Yeah, very well put. The opening comments here. For the audience, when you see the Kashmir map, which is incorrectly shown in the U.S. most of the times, and that's what Arunji is referring to. So Kashmir is filled with artifacts from the ancient Vedic culture. Very few people know that northwestern Kashmir, which is occupied by Pakistan, has Takshashila also there, and which is Takshashila was the place where Mahabharata was spoken, and Vaishampayan spoke Mahabharata to Janvajay there. Sarpyag was done over there, and also it was part of Bharat Maharaj kingdom in Ramayana, also called Kaikeyi Pradesh, and parts of Iran were also included there today. But these Balkanized states were mostly created or authorized by the British colonialists. It was not there before. Now, coming back to the Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir, what is the cultural significance for Hindus in that area? If you can enlighten a little bit.
See, the cultural significance is a lot of seeds of learning is there, and there's a lot of see. More importantly, it's the people when we talk about culture. So I would rather than talking about cultural symbols. Most importantly, the people of Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So it was what happened in 47 was that because of Sheikh Abdullah, who was the Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, and the Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. So because of their policies, the people there didn't want to be part of Pakistan, but somehow they became part of Pakistan because the forces were called halfway when they were almost there to liberate the complete Jammu and Kashmir from the parts which were there occupied by Pakistan forcibly. So when they were almost on the verge of liberating them, and that was the time when Nehru took the matter of Kashmir to United Nations and a ceasefire was called. And so this is what happened. That's why we see in recent times also we have seen a lot of agitations which have happened there. So culturally, the uh, people of Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir are much more closely linked to the people of Jammu and Kashmir who are living on the Indian side rather than being connected with Pakistan. In fact, Pakistan has, just like China tried to do in Tibet, Pakistan has tried to change the demography and the cultural profile of Pakistan occupied Jammu Kashmir also, and there has been a lot of resistance from inside. But unfortunately, because of limited access to that area, especially Indian scholars don't have access to that area, so hardly see any authentic books or monographs or works of important works coming out in the international arena, which are focused on Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Whereas India has granted complete access to most of the foreign media, and anybody can go there. So that's why you see a lot of books which are there on the Indian side of the Kashmir, but not on Pakistan occupied Jammu Kashmir. So culturally, I would say the most significant, see, cultural symbols are very important, but ultimately it is the people are at the core of the whole, cultural framework. So people there are, I think, feeling suffocated, and there have been some news reports, sporadic news reports about that also. So I would look at it basically, and there are a lot of seeds of learnings which are there's a lot of ancient temples which are there in Pakistan occupied Jammu Kashmir, which have not been maintained well. Many of them have been turned into ruins. So it's very unfortunate that that long tradition of cultural tradition. So they are just trying to suppress that in Pakistan occupied Jammu Kashmir.
One American researcher had commented a few years back that there were more than 350,000 Hindu temples in Pakistan when it was divided. And recently someone commented that where there was a need for India to give up on the entire state of Pakistan and Afghanistan because it is filled with cultural symbols. You know, people can remove the faith but cannot remove the culture. It's not possible. And very Arabs they call the entire Pakistan as Al Hind. Even Pakistan is included there, and they call the residents as kafir. And this has word has been used. But sticking back to Pakistan, POJK. Now, when we talk about that land, do you think that the people who have been revolting there against the administration of Pakistan itself will ever get a chance to come back to where they want to come? They want to connect to India more than that land, that country.
See, I'll tell you, uh, what has happened there. Pakistan is unfortunately, I would say, because if it happens with any state, and Pakistan is India's neighbor, so to have an unstable neighbor is the most unfortunate thing. So, Pakistan is a failed state, and ultimately, we saw one split in 1971. We have seen the fissures in Pakistani state or Pakistani nation or Pakistan as a country. So we have seen what is happening in Gilgit, Baltistan, then Northwest Frontier Province, and we know that that is hardly under the authority of the Pakistani government. So similarly, in Pakistan occupied Jammu Kashmir also, I think with a stronger, it may take some time, but ultimately, if the wall can vanish between the East Germany and the West Germany, and if European Union can happen, and we have seen these things happening in the history. It takes some time, but I think ultimately it is going to happen because Pakistan itself is going to get, I think, balkanized or broken into several pieces. So it is just a matter of time. And I think all these areas which have a close connect with India, so they are going to ultimately come back to. See, Pakistan is, if you look at the composition of Pakistan as a state right now, so there are only, it is ruled by uh, Punjabi Muslims, as well as Punjab is at the Punjab and to some extent Sindh, you can say, but largely the rest of the state they hardly have any, or the rest of the ethnic groups they hardly have any participation in the process of government there or in the political process there. And culturally and ethnically, Jammu Kashmir, they have tried to impose Urdu there, like what happened on Indian side of the Jammu Kashmir also, unfortunately. But now that thing has been corrected because the Narendra Modi government in the recent parliament session, so they brought a very interesting bill which has been turned into a law, about which not much has been talked about, but Kashmiri, Dogri, and Hindi. They have also been made the official languages of Jammu and Kashmir in India. Earlier, only Urdu was the official language of Jammu and Kashmir. So, uh, whether it is language, whether it is culture, whether it is the lifestyle, and whether it is so ethnically, culturally, Jammu Kashmir, Pakistan occupied Jammu Kashmir has been uh, kept, you know, away from joining the Indian part of Jammu and Kashmir forcefully by Pakistan. And with Pakistan, as I mentioned, being a failed state, and it has been losing grip over all its regions. So I think it's just a matter of time. And you don't need to invade or you don't need to attack Pakistan. I don't think any military action would be required to do that. I think that's going to happen on its own.
Yeah, I the term comes to my mind based on what you're saying is called POP, Punjab occupied Pakistan. So
Yeah.
it's like that's the story of Pakistan, the whole country. It's a pop culture there. Now coming back to the China occupied Jammu Kashmir, because both these countries have taken a land of basically inhabitants of Kashmir, native of Kashmir, and the most surprising thing is that Kashmir as a valley, it's a very small valley as compared to the whole state. And recently the Indian government created three different divisions: Jammu, the Kashmir Valley, and the Ladakh and Leh. Ladakh and Leh forms 80% of the territory, which includes Baltistan, which is still occupied by Pakistan. So when you say about COJK, the culturally it is very similar to India, like but it is occupied by China. Is there any uh, plan to take that place back? I know it's a very political question, but
I think China also, though a lot of people say this thing, but see China, uh, the mainland China is a very small, used to be a very small country, but by using the force and authoritarian, methods, which is typical of a communist regime and a communist dictatorship. So they have expanded into, and China today looks a very big country, but it's almost a similar situation. I've visited China. I have had the opportunity to visit China several times and see the situation firsthand there. So it's also they have kept most of the regions forcefully together, just like Soviet Russia when it used to be like USSR. So all these regions were kept together forcefully as a part of the one country. But as soon as communism collapsed there, and we saw that so many nations came into existence, the similar thing is going to happen in China also. And as far as CUJK is concerned, so it's largely basically the population is very sparse there, but it is strategically important area. Saichin, large area of Saichin is there. So strategically, it is very important. And so right now, I think the focus is largely on highlighting the fault lines which are there in Pakistan in context of the Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir.
mm,
And gradually, I think we are going to move to, and now issues are being raised about COJK also. But I think it will take some time before this issue becomes prominent on international agenda. Nationally, of course, India is concerned about it, and a section of intellectuals. There have been a series of webinars in the recent past about, and recently Some very nice books have also come out, which have uh, given specific details about COJK. So the discussion has started, but I think focus right now is on POJK. It will take some time before we come to COJK. But practically speaking, if you ask me, the it is not possible in today's world to take military action and take these regions back. Whatever jingoism some of the people may indulge in, we'll have to wait uh, for these fault lines to become more prominent and the collapse of the states there, and then it is going to come to India. Then they themselves will be coming and joining, the India, because ultimately they have been part of India and they have been forcefully taken away. So I think it's going to take some time, but I believe that both Pakistan and China are failed states. I know it's a very strong thing to say about China. Most of the people think that China is a role model, but no, I don't think so. I think they're keeping everybody forcefully together. It is just a matter of time. As I told you, I visited there. So I have seen that China is a society which is just, waiting to explode. There is so much of suppression there. So, and ultimately, you cannot keep on suppressing people beyond a point. So, I think China is going to collapse also. And then we are going to see a larger integration of COJK and POJK with the Jammu Kashmir in India.
Uh, Communism and socialism are two general enemies. Like they have emptied every single nation of the planet. Few before 91, nobody could ever think that Soviet Union will collapse. Nobody could think because it is largely based on propaganda. I have seen propaganda of CCCP in India, and most of the Americans can't relate to that. But I've seen the propaganda that how CCCP or Soviet Union was a very successful country, very strong country, and when it collapsed, the potato was selling for $20 a pound and 20 US dollars a pound, and inflation in the US has been pretty constant. And at that time, US had zero inflation, if you look at the history. And so it collapsed. And I think the same thing is going to happen because from outside, everybody, especially the media, which has been bought by the Chinese Communist Party, they claim China has a very big military force and everything. But general assessment is that their military is just 20% of what they show in the media. And but whereas there's a common joke, when the Indians fires a missile, every missile may work. When a Chinese fires a missile, then only 10% may work. Or recently they fired against the US ships. They fired four missiles, and the closest one came to around 300 meters, and the rest of them nobody knows where they went. One in fact exploded where they launched from. So that's the propaganda. Do you think the same mindset is going on in the POP, which is going to explode also in a similar way?
I think, Aditya I think one has to understand the genesis of this whole POJK and COJK thing. That's very important. Then, when the context is clear, then things become much clearer. So, one misnomer which has been there and which has been propagated by a section of Western writers, that in 1947, when Jammu Kashmir acceded to India and Maharaja Hari Singh signed a treaty of accession with India, at that time there was an invasion of tribals from Pakistan. Uh, and then when the ceasefire happened, so these tribals were there and they had occupied certain places. So that place went to Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir. No, it is a misnomer. The fact is that Pakistani army, they invaded India, and there were two invasions, not one invasion. One was in October 1947, and the second one was in February 1948. And in October 1947, when they were almost there to capture Srinagar, that was the time when Maharaja Hari Singh sought India's help. And I just want to quote one very interesting. There is this Major Onkar Singh Kalkat, who had opted for India, and he was part of the Indian Army. And he has told specifically about uh, the at that time he was posted in Bannu in northwestern Frontier Province, NWFP, because the armies were also getting kind of divided, and so he had opted, of course, to come to India, but he was posted at that time there. So on 20th August 1947, that is just 5 days after the independence, he stumbled upon a letter marked personal or top secret, and it was addressed to his brigade commander C.P. Murray. And Murray was a British Army officer, and it was signed by General Frank Messervy, who he was at that time the Chief of Staff of Pakistani Army. Attached to the letter was a copy of the plan that Pakistani Army had prepared for launching invasion against Jammu and Kashmir. And the code name of that plan was Operation Gulmarg. We know Gulmarg is a famous place in Kashmir. And they the plan consisted of using the non-state actors such as the Pashtun tribesmen as the foot soldiers. And each now there were details about Operation Gulmarg that each tribe was asked to raise a lashkar of 1,000 persons. Lashkar means, you can say, group. And then the deputy commissioners, who were British, and the political agents in that area, they were asked to recruit these tribesmen. And the Pathan officers from the Frontier Force Regiment were to function as commanders of these tribal lashkars. And as per this plan, all the arms and ammunition which was to be made available to them, it was to be moved to Abbottabad in Pakistan at that time by 15th October. And an area of 10 miles on outskirts of Abbottabad was marked for the invading force. Now, if you want to read more details about this Operation Gulmarg, so Major Kalkat has written a very beautiful book and very informative book. It's titled The Far Flung Frontiers. I'll just repeat: The Far Flung Frontiers by Major Kalkat. It's his memoir, and I think you must basically read that. Then you had another gentleman. His name was Colonel Akbar Khan, and he was Director of Weapons and Equipments, GHQ Rawalpindi, General Headquarters Rawalpindi. And he was supposed to, as a part of the Operation Gulmarg, organize the Azad Army. The Azad Army is basically the deserters from the state. So these were the specific plans basically which they had uh, prepared. And now, so one has to understand that it was a very well planned invasion, and there were massive human rights violations. There were massacres, rapes, loot, arson, and there were deserters from the Jammu Kashmir security forces at that time. Also from Maharaja's forces, the Muslims had a number of Muslims deserted, and they and one last interesting thing, I'll tell you how this whole conspiracy was hatched. And one more thing, Jinnah was in know of everything. It is also misnomer when people say that no, Jinnah did not know about Pakistani army's plan to invade Kashmir, or that the tribesmen had invaded Kashmir, this thing, and Jinnah had absolutely knowledge about everything. In early August 1947, there was this woman called Nasira Siddiqui, and she was sent there to subvert loyalties of Muslim officers and other ranks in J&K administration, Jammu and Kashmir administration. And when the state government came to know about it, she was forced to leave the state immediately, but she re-entered Kashmir. And then in Patan on 27th October 1947, she received a bullet injury. This is also on the record. So this is how this whole thing was planned. So right from the beginning, even before we had got independence, Pakistan had started. The people who were going there to go and man the Pakistan, and when this whole process started of Pakistani army came into existence. So even slightly before that, and as I told you that earlier also, that they had full backing of the Britishers in that. And here we had Pandit Nehru as Prime Minister, who was eating out of Lord Mountbatten's hands. And his reluctance uh, to sign the accession treaty, because he wanted Sheikh Abdullah to be part of the government, and Maharaja Hari Singh knew that Sheikh Abdullah will create mischief. So that is how the whole thing got delayed. And another misnomer was created that Maharaja Hari Singh was delaying because he was toying with the idea of keeping Jammu Kashmir as an independent state, which is absolutely false. It was Nehru's reluctance to sign the treaty which delayed it, and ultimately forced Sheikh Maharaja Hari Singh to take Sheikh Abdullah into the administration and run the administration. And the result was that when Indian forces were going there to liberate the Pakistan occupied Jammu and Kashmir, Sheikh Abdullah did not allow that. He called them halfway back. He called them back when they were almost there on the verge of liberating this area. And this is how we lost the Pakistan to the Jammu part of Jammu and Kashmir to Pakistan.
Such an enlightening insight, and I must tell you that the most of the Americans in the power, they know this fact very well, and especially the State Department of USA has consistently supported these true historical accounts. And also partly the British have to be blamed also, because the British acceded to that plan. They were aware of the plan and they acceded to the plan. In terms of the the logical question is, then next is the next question is, the people of that part want to join India, and it's and you also explained that it will be natural after some time that they will be coming to India, in a way, because if you see the economy in 1700s, Afghanistan had a very flourishing economy, because the Pakistan was integral part of India at that time. The trade to Central Asian states used to pass through Afghanistan, and it was a rich territory. It is recorded in the British history also, and most of the traders of Kabul were Hindus, and they are the ones who controlled the entire trade. And when they were destroyed, so by 1919, Afghanistan, when when the British signed the treaty with the Durand Line, the Afghanistan became an independent nation. Or so again, the British have played the mischief over there. And in 19, so after, so all these territories, as they went out of the control of the Hindu, which are original inhabitants of those lands became poorer, and there is a huge identity crisis also, because they don't know who they are. They, on the faith basis, their origins of faith come from from Arabs, but they don't accept them as their part of their faith. So it's the entire society is held in limbo. They don't they don't have an identity, and there is no identity. It's everything is very what do you call it, is very transactional. After that, there is no core basis of growth, but economically all those areas have become very poor, extremely poor. And despite, land is still the same. So when it was in the hands of the Hindus, it was prospering, and now it is not prospering. Do you think the ideology is the main problem?
Yeah, I think ideology is the main problem because Hindu philosophy believes in coexistence. And that's why, India at one point of time, when China was not a communist, not under communism, at one point of time, India and China, uh, I'm talking about um, uh, even much before kind of medieval period. I'm not even talking about thousands of years back. So India and China together, they had 60% global share of the world market. And at one point of time, India had more than 40% of the global share of the world market. And why that was happening? That was happening because we allowed everybody to come here, settle here, do what they want to do, live the way they want to live. So that coexistence, because that is the for an economy to survive, you need to have a very strong cultural edifice, and that cultural edifice has to be built on the concept of coexistence. That is the only edifice which makes it sustainable. Otherwise, it is unsustainable, as we saw what happened in case of the communist countries. We are also looking at, the global cycles of depression, which are happening too frequently now in capitalism, the countries driven by capitalism also. So, and UN started talking about sustainable development goals a few years ago. The Hindu philosophy has always been talking about sustainable development goals. So, what we were talking about thousands of years ago, that is what made it. That is the only way a country or an economy can be made prosperous. It cannot be, your motive cannot be profit. It cannot be a profit-driven economy. Cannot be, is not a sustainable idea. I would suggest to our viewers uh, that if they can get hold of, you can get it online also. There is a very interesting book and very wonderful book called The Third Way. It has been written by an RSS ideologue, uh, Dattopant Thengdi. Incidentally, on 10th November, his birth centenary was there also. So he's written a wonderful book. And Aditya ji, as you said earlier, but just wanted to correct you a little bit when you said that nobody would have imagined that Soviet Russia will collapse or communism will go this way. Dattopant Thengdi is on the record predicting in 1960s that the communism is going to end before 1990. So, and we saw that what happened in 89. And
Yeah.
so I'm this third way gives you the real new economic model, which is neither capitalism nor socialism or communism, and it gives you a third way. So it's worth reading. I would say that people who want to look at sustainable models. But one more thing, Aditya ji, I want to draw your conclusion to. Uh, this is, when I was talking about the invasion of Jammu and Kashmir by Pakistani. So there are a couple of things which our viewers must know. Uh, Today, US and Europe and a lot of people talk about human rights violations. They often blame Indian forces also. I just want to tell you, everybody knows about Auschwitz, which happened in, where the thousands of Jews were killed. A similar thing happened during that invasion, worse than that probably, in Mirpur area. The population was 25,000. Only 2,000 people came out alive. And there are written testimonies to that hundreds of women were kidnapped, dishonored, sold in the towns of Western Punjab and Northwest Frontier province. And there was this Ali Beg camp where, after this invasion had happened, and non-Muslims were made to live in that camp, and then all of them were massacred. All of them were. And there is another incident which happened. We have just celebrated Diwali, but there is one area in Jammu Kashmir which never celebrates Diwali. That is Rajouri area.
Mm.
Why? Because more than 7,000 Hindus were killed on the night of Diwali by the Pakistani army and their foot soldiers. All of them, most of the women saved their honor because they didn't want to get raped or to be sold by swallowing poison. So the Hindus of Rajuris, ever since this 1947 thing happened, they never celebrate Diwali. And I can go on and on. There are n number of such incidents. I think the world must be told this story that there was ethnic cleansing of non-Muslims, and more than 50,000 Hindus were killed by the Pakistani. They were selected, chosen out, shot dead, raped. Even the kids were not spared. There are gory details of, and the world never talks about that. It only talks about the UN resolution. I think 50,000, more than 50,000 Hindus were killed. This story must be told to the world, and the world must know about it.
Great points and great numbers actually that you put out. It fills my heart with sadness for hearing this. And thank you for bringing it out. This is a great data that you have shown. There is another book written by Manoj Rakit. and I really respect that author. Very unknown author, but I respect that author. It's a very small book he has written. With pictures, he has explained the edicts of the atrocities on Hindus in Kashmir Valley, as well as, and I happen to have the copy of that. And how I got the copy was somebody had thrown that copy in the garbage in one of the U.S. temples, and I happened to collect it and I stored it with me. So in that book also the details are mentioned there, what happened there. Now, one thing comes to my, like we said, the ideology and the selective killing. Uh, it is even worse than the killing in Germany, because by Hitler. Because in Hitler, and I would not compare that with due respect, because I don't accept what Hitler did at all. But here it was deep hatred, not because of any economic or political reasons. It was purely on the basis of religion, and and that has continued. People of India may talk anything about political and politics, but the hatred is coming from a source which is not. The common sense defies it. Why would anybody hate such a productive population? And I think most of the policymakers in India ignore that aspect, and or don't speak it out of just being nice. But don't you
Trying
think
to
the
be
time?
politically correct.
Yeah, but don't you think the time has come to speak it openly, that it is not any political thing, it's a pure religious hatred?
See, I think the problem in India is a little complex also, because most of the Muslims we have, they are converted Muslims. As you mentioned, I would mention another book. It's by Mr. K.S. Lal. It's a very small book, published by Voice of India. You can get it online also, and I believe it's available. Uh, the PDFs are also available online to read free of cost. It's Indian Muslims, who are they? So it tells you the genesis of. But coming to your point, I think now voices are being raised. People are not trying to be politically correct. The M factor, what you call the Muslim factor, which used to drive the Indian politics, so it has been taken out, in the sense that that factor does not drive the Indian politics anymore. So there are a lot of people who have started coming out and talking about it, but more needs to be done. I agree with you absolutely. But Aditya, I think you and our viewers also must understand that we have had the legacy of a left of the center thought process driving the whole Indian nation for almost 70 years, when Congress was ruling there, or even when bit of other parties, still BJP came into power. So it takes time. They have influenced the thought process. They have influenced the polity of this country in such a way. And so if it has taken 70 years, obviously it would take at least 10, 10, 15, 20 years to reshape the discourse in the Indian politics or in the Indian public life or public sphere. So it will take some time, but I think we are moving in the right direction. And we have now leaders like Yogi Adityanath, and then of course Narendra Modi is there. See, like you see, significantly they don't indulge in symbolism. Earlier there used to be all the time iftars and everything, but now there are no iftar parties which are held generally by politicians, or the number of iftar parties have come down. And they have started reading Hanuman Chalisa and going to temples. So I think, and I would say that it is not good to go from one extreme to another. But I think it's people have started speaking, but it will take some time. It will take some time, because the unfortunately the significant number from the Muslim population, so they have also been, kind of fed on this diet of lies, that okay, as a minority, they have special rights, and they can do anything, and the majority population, so they have to live with a guilt consciousness just because they are majority. So the concept of equal citizens, it will take some time, but I think we are moving in the right direction. And if we continue to move in the right direction, we will achieve the goal sooner than expected.
No, that's the political correctness has destroyed every single society. If the society cannot speak truth and people cannot express themselves, which was happened in India and happening in the US also now, with the extreme left is trying to control the narrative through Twitter, Facebook, and also through their controlled media. You mentioned about human rights last time. You know, human rights protection has become a euphemism for denying the right of speech to the oppressed. See, the aggressor cannot claim a victim, but in the human rights thing, the champions, they jump in when the victim tries to defend themselves. So they don't even want the victim to defend themselves. And that happened in India to a large extent, where the large majority Hindu population, more than 90%, I would say, to be real, census shows incorrect in India, because many of the the Hindu is the predominant culture there. They are denied the right to speech, respond in the name of secularism. And when you that happens, it creates discontent for a long term. And when it explodes, it's going to be the worst consequences, because free speech you cannot deny. If like somebody is feeling like that, the best way is to hear them out and make corrections, so that we stop the long term dissatisfaction, which can result in any direction, can be violent too. So don't you think that that policy has to be completely abandoned? France has done it, Angola has done it, Austria has done it, and I believe, and I must tell you this: France, they are the ones who produce the worst philosophies in the world. They are the ones who produce leftist, right wing. They are the ones who produced communism, Marxism. That's what promoted by them. Rest of the world has just eaten to from the French plate. And French kiss may be good, but not this one. And so now they have changed their policy also, and it will have an impact on all French controlled territories across the world. And France had a very deep impact on America, including the Statue of Liberty came from France. The Democrats' philosophy of classical, sorry, the social liberalism came from France. The Republican philosophy of classical liberalism came from France. And so, don't you think if France has changed and this era is ended now, political correctness?
Yeah, I think countries should not be compared because India has its own, cultural context. And in fact, we have never believed in the concept of, this. This is a very typical Western concept of human rights. Uh, in India, we believe in the concept of more in the concept of duties. If I perform my duties properly, then your rights will be taken care of. And this whole concept of one is that. But second, coming back to what you said, I think the way India supported France, and see, India is a huge country, and we also have a significant, Muslim population, and it is also egged by the kind of political structure which India has. So there are a number of parties which are ready to instigate Muslims against the state for petty political gains. And so we have to deal with, and we have a legacy, an unfortunate legacy of the Congress rule. And in fact, the appeasement of Muslims started in India during the freedom struggle itself, when in 1920 the Khilafat movement and early 20s the Ali brothers were there. And then you had the Mopla genocide of Hindus, about which people do not talk, in Kerala in the early 1920s. And incidentally, this year is the 100th year of the Khilafat movement also, and kind of and the Mopla genocide of Hindus also. So this has happened, and our people did not learn from the mistake which we committed in the past. But now, after this new government has come, so I think from 2014 onwards, they are going in the right direction. And yeah, I'm neither a member of BJP nor a spokesperson for them. And but as a journalist, I've covered for the last 20, 25 years, odd years, different government. So I think that this government can bring a change, but you also rightly mentioned that ultimately the change has to come from within the society. And now a strong section of society has started speaking in open voices and opposing this appeasement of Muslims. And yes, we can learn from countries like France, but ultimately India will have to devise its own ways and means because see, at the end of the day, we are a country of 1.3 billion people. So the scale of problems which we face is much different, and we are not an authoritarian regime like China. So the kind of complex situation which we face, it's a little more complex than rest of the countries, and the scale is also different. So we'll have to devise our own ways and means. But I think the good beginning has been made, and we are going in the right direction. And the biggest example is you see the way construction of Ram Temple started on August 5 this year. So and we have seen scrapping of Section 35 amendment of Article 370, bringing in and this Citizenship Amendment Act. So all these things are pointing towards that. Yes, we are moving in the right direction, and probably sometimes it is better to convey the meaning by actions, rather than talking too much about it. So I think this government believes in that, and it is getting full support of the society. So the writing on the wall is very clear that if you will not go for appeasement of Muslims, if you will treat citizens equally, if you will allow Hindus also to speak up their mind, even if it is unpleasant for other people, and even if it is not politically what you call correct. So, but you will have to do that. If you don't do that, you will not get votes in the elections. So I think that's a very welcome change which has happened in India, and that's why Modi came back. He's called Hindu Hriday Samrat, and he came back with a greater majority than before, which was not at all expected by anybody. It really happens in Indian politics.
In the one of the next shows, I would like to a little bit eat your brains on debunking Hindu rate of growth, and I think which you'd love to talk on that. Now, coming my last question: whichever country in the world in the last 70 years, Pakistan is just a new name, and I still consider it a Hindu territory, in my personal opinion. But whichever country Pakistan is associated, that country has collapsed. So it was they associated with US to a large extent, and you can see the US has
Yeah,
already
US
come
is the
down a
net.
lot down. Associated with China, China is facing problems. Now they're becoming friends with Turkey, which has become the new Pakistan in that part. So do you think that the bad omens of associating with Pakistan and North Korea has any impact on the Turkey's future now?
See, a failed state is a dead weight for any other country because you only come with the excess baggage of problems because you are a failed state. So that is what is happening. That when two countries come together, then both of them have to draw from each other's strengths, and it has to be a mutually beneficial relationship. But when you have a failed state like Pakistan, where the non-state actors are more important, and as I said, that it's a failed state. So what do you bring to the table? You only draw strength from your ally, and you make it, you keep on making it weaker and weaker and weaker. So, and your ally has to always kind of basically defend you, and there is a limit to that, and that's how the allies also suffer. So I think, and as far as Turkey and Pakistan relation is concerned, I think Pakistan, see, Turkey has been trying to, under Erdogan, they have been trying to emerge, and Turkey always had this. You pick up the history, right, from the Ottoman Empire. So Turkey always had this dream that it should be the central axis of the Muslim power. So that is what it is trying to do, and that's why they are taking such belligerent posters, and it is a radical. It is trying to become the rallying point of radical Islam. So and Pakistan is a as a failed state. I think this alliance, of course, Turkey is going to get hurt. Turkey is going to get hurt by allying with Pakistan, and it is not going to get any benefit from it. And I think it's also just a matter of time before we see a collapse in Turkey also, because after Kamal Pasha had come there, from 1930s onwards, so there was Turkey had become a very liberal society, but now a section of clergy and people like Erdogan, so all of them have come together and they are trying to make Turkey a radical Islamic country. So there are inner contradictions in Turkish society now because of that, and because of the crackdown on press and everything, we don't see much news coming out of these fault lines. See, similar things are like when you look at all these authoritarian countries, radical Islamic countries, whether it is Saudi Arabia, you have Iran, you have Pakistan, you have Turkey. So some of them are Shia, some of them are Sunni. But overall, wherever you will see these authoritarian regimes, there would be always internal contradictions in the society, whether it is a religious authoritarianism or whether it is a political authoritarianism, like in China. So these lead to the fall of they basically collapse on their own because of these inner contradictions. That has been a broad trend over the last 200 odd years, if you'll see at all these states. So I think this is what is going to happen.
Thank you so much, Arun Anandji. You're a wealth of information, and I like your style of journalism. Very investigative and deep analytical. For viewers, if you like this content, please do subscribe to our channel. Our channel is our main purpose is to highlight or remove mythology. This is all mythology, fake news, and we have to say the right thing. And it's important to speak the right or truthful words, or so that we can educate correctly. The lot of misinformation has already been spread by the colonial powers. Now, I'll talk about South America and my new book coming on America, Native American cultures. You'll see that a lot of wrong information has been told to Americans. There have been untold miseries on Native Americans. Even by rough estimate, we are talking about 100 million Native Americans killed by the European settlers. So, with that, thank you very much, Arun Anandji. And it's
Thank
a
you,
real pleasure
Alviji.
to talk to
Thank
you
you for
always.
inviting me.
So, namaste and have a nice day.
Thank you.